Welcome to Buffalo HealthCast, the official health equity podcast of the University at Buffalo's School of Public Health and Health Professions. In this podcast, we cover topics related to health equity in Buffalo, the U.S., and globally. This season, we'll take a look at food insecurity and health equity on a global scale. You'll hear from experts around the world who specialize in areas like urban agriculture and food contamination, soil science, food sovereignty, refugee health, intensive agriculture, and more. This season's episodes were completed in Dr. Kasia Cordes' Global Health class, a graduate-level course offered at the University at Buffalo and produced by the School of Public Health and Health Professions.
Welcome to another episode of Buffalo HealthCast. We are your co-hosts, Sarah Robinson
and Leah Bargnesi.
Today we have with us three fantastic experts in the areas of food contamination, urban agriculture, and food insecurity.
Dr. Prathima Nalam is an assistant professor in the Department of Materials Design and Innovation in the University at Buffalo's School of Engineering and Applied Sciences. Her research focuses on tribology, soft mechanics, surface and interfacial forces, and atomic force microscopy.
We also have Dr. Anya Paltseva with us, who is currently an international urban soil scientist at the University of Louisiana at LaFayette in the School of Geosciences. Dr. Paltseva's expertise lies in urban soil contamination and remediation of urban gardens.
Finally, Jeanette Koncikowski has joined us. Jeanette currently serves as Executive Director of Grassroots Gardens of Western New York. Grassroots Gardens of Western New York is a dedicated group of community gardeners and activists with the mission to share knowledge, power, and resources to grow healthy food, heal systemic harm, and strengthen neighborhood connections in Western New York through community gardens. Our three experts are all working together on a project related to soil contamination. So tell us about the project. What questions are you trying to answer, and what does this research entail? If Dr. Nalam, if you want to start.
So we are looking at the health of the soil, and we believe that the health of the soil is directly related to our health, and only all the urban activities that we have been doing, like from centuries, from the time that we have started using lead paints, or we used quite a bit of unleaded petrol and all these things. So all our activities have slowly contaminated urban soil, specifically with lots of contaminants. And there are different kinds of contaminants, organic, inorganic, and this specific project we are looking at inorganic contaminants such as lead, which is a heavy metal, and we are looking at sustainable ways to remediate them. And the concept that we are trying to use here is to get inspired from nature, which actually uses mycelium, which are nothing but the root part of mushroom. We are using that root tissue and making them into a membranes and trying to remove lead from the soil. So that's the overall theme of the project is.
That's so interesting. And the thing that we loved about this project and about why it's so unique, because you all come from such different disciplines, can you all explain a little bit what your roles are in this project and how you're sort of working together with your own expertise to bring it together and conduct your research? Dr. Paltseva, do you want to talk about your role a little bit?
Sure. I got involved in this project because originally the researchers from University of Buffalo reached out to Dr. Howard Mielke in New Orleans, who is a well-known researcher on lead poisoning in children and soil lead. And he referred the research team to me because he recently retired and I sort of inherited his lab from Tulane University. So I was really interested in this idea because I think it's so unique to use this mycelium, and it's in New York, which I have a personal connection. I used to live in New York City, so I definitely was interested to participate and get to know other researchers, because this is not just typical soil scientists you work with. It's a different expertise, and we all work on the same issue from different angles, and we learn from each other. So in my role, it's mostly soil testing. We test the soils before the treatments, and we will do more in spring and coming years after the treatments, and actually see the efficacy, how effective the remediation is. And we will test for different soil parameters, but most important ones is to see lead concentrations, what they were before, what they were after, and eventually we'll develop recommendations for practitioners.
And Dr. Nalam, can you talk a little bit about your role?
Yeah, sure. So I come into this project as a material scientist. So we are basically looking for new materials or developing new materials that can do several. I mean, it can be from electronics to semiconductors to anything. But I was specifically interested in creating new filtration membranes to remove toxins from the environment. So it could be air, water, or soil. And I specifically got interested in mycelium because there is a Western New York company that works on producing mycelium materials in a very large scale. So I was wondering why not we, and they were using it for basically packaging and also for acoustic and thermal isolations and stuff like that. So my idea was that mycelium as such we know is such a good toxin remover in nature. Can we use this dry mycelium now that it is more easily transportable? You cannot grow live mycelium everywhere, let's say. But once you dry them out, then they are easy to package, easy to go around. And then the whole idea started that can we now start using them as filters? And Buffalo has been like the hotspot for lead. And this immediately connected us, especially when I was talking with Kasia on this, and we thought that this is something that we should address, and this went into this soil study, and we also worked with Jeanette to do a much more broader impact of this activity. So that's how I came in. Yeah.
Great. And then Jeanette, first off, can you tell us a little bit about Grassroot Gardens? What is it and how does it interact with the community in Buffalo?
Sure. So Grassroots Gardens is Buffalo Niagara's community gardening organization. We're an advocacy organization. This past season, there were 107 community and school gardens in our network. And we really exist to be able to advocate for the community gardens, to be able to help fund the community gardens, to help start new community gardens. So we really act as a facilitator between the community, the land, most of which is currently leased through the city of Buffalo or the city of Niagara Falls. We garden in both cities. And then, really working with residents to build the gardens in their neighborhoods and their schools in the way in which they want to manage them and run them. And Grassroots, one of the things that the community manages the day-to-day of the community garden. So we don't get involved in like, how is the garden set up, who's doing what, who's watering, who's weeding, what food are you growing. But we, because of our lease with the cities, are asked to monitor for food safety and to make sure that the materials that are being used are safe so that food is not contaminated. And so that is one of the many things that we do at Grassroots Gardens, is just kind of act as that facilitator and that educator around food and things like lead contamination, because we are growing on lots that most likely have some level of lead contamination. And we've had lots in the city where, you can have one right next to another and one will have heavy lead contamination and another won't. It really depends on the very specific history of the housing that was on that vacant land. And so one of the things that we do to prevent that, obviously, like many urban gardens, is we grow above ground in raised beds, and there's always a barrier level between the ground and soil. And so we're using, non-pressure treated lumber, we're using organic soil, we're using organic seed, really trying to make the food that grows as healthy as possible for the community members that are consuming it.
And then what about this project? How did you get involved in it?
Yeah, so we are long been a partner with the University of Buffalo School of Public Health, and already had some connections to various partners there. And I believe when Dr. Cordes approached us, it was through a referral from Dr. Samina Raja at the UB Food Lab, who is also a primary partner of ours. And Dr. Raja and her students have been a longtime evaluator of Grassroots Gardens. And so we were all kind of connected and found out about their interest in studying lead in the soil. And one of the things that and then the remediation through the mycelium, which is really cool, because what better way to deal with contamination than through nature? And one of the things that I was really personally excited about as an alumni of the university was that UB has a commitment to applied research. And so not just doing research for the sake of doing research, but research to improve people's lives, research to make sure that there is an impact in the community. And so we were approached about partnering with them, and kind of just first as a way to learn for the researchers involved, to learn about like kind of boots on the ground, what happens in terms of gardening and urban ag around soil, and what are some of our gardeners' concerns about the soil. And then from there, we really were able to kind of grow a plan to add a public education component to this project. And so there is the research project, and then there is also the opportunity to use the research project to educate the community about everything from, just safe urban gardening practices to how does lead get in the soil to what is the possibilities for remediation.
Dr. Paltseva, so you've done a lot of research about lead in soil. Can you tell us about what effects lead exposure actually has on human health, and how common are these exposures? How concerned should we be about them, especially in an urban setting? And how are we seeing the effects of them today?
Definitely, lead exposure has been drastically decreased since 20th century, when it was really serious issues and lead was everywhere in gasoline and lead paint. But the legacy of that deposition in the air or in the soil is still present. So what used to be emitted into the air or painted on the walls is now going down to the soil. And this is why partially Buffalo has such issues, or any other big cities in the US or in the world. So it's really, there is a relationship between the size of the city and how much industry was there, roads, and of course, how many people live there in older buildings or buildings that are painted with the lead before 1978, and if those homes were remediated after this or not, were they repainted, or was any cleanup done? The dust that falls off this paint gets to the soil, and when children play in the soil, they inhale it or maybe ingest it through their fingers, and this is where the biggest problem lies. It's mostly for children. Kids are way more susceptible to lead poisoning than adults. Adults, of course, can still get exposed, but it's maybe more through their occupations, and if they are, working in the condition when they do not protect themselves, or they don't know about the contamination and they're working in those fields. But in most cities, we're really concerned about children and the playground areas or gardens, backyard gardens versus public places. And the previous research in New York City showed that the private yards, backyards, have more contamination of lead than public areas. Because in public areas, different organizations, nonprofit organizations, Department of Parks and Recreation, they constantly change soil, they add lawn, maybe they add mulch, compost, so they do some sort of introduction of a new material, and it helps to bring down the previous contamination to very low levels. But in private yards, people very often don't know, especially if it's new buyers and they don't know anything about the land history of this home or overall about the neighborhood, and they have little children. So one of the things is really to learn what was done before in this plot and test, and then we'll find recommendations for the families, what would be the best solution for them. But it's really a big problem. It's everywhere. The homeowner can become researchers by studying history of their lot and simply send the samples to the labs and see what it is, because as Jeanette's saying, one plot can be different from another plot, and it's really hard to know unless you do a little bit of investigation. Very often the inner cities, inner parts of the cities like downtowns or where the industries were, you would have high concentrations, and when it gets closer to suburbs, you will see less contamination. It's very typical pattern for big cities. So it's high in inner cities and drops close to outskirts.
Dr. Paltseva, can you explain what bioavailability is, and if that is something that heightens contamination from produce that's grown in urban farming?
Good question. So bioavailability is really a fraction of toxin in metal, in our case is lead, that can harm a human body or even a plant, depending how you define bioavailability. Some researchers refer to humans and plants. Some say phytoavailability is for plants and bioavailability is for animals. In simple words, it's the fraction that can be toxic for humans. And bioavailability of lead specifically will be determined by different phases or different chemical presence of this metal, like what form lead exists in. If it's a lead carbonate or lead oxide, it may be much easier to dissolve, can be uptaken by humans much easier. But if it's lead sulfides or phosphates or combined with organic matter, it will be less bioavailable. When we test soil, we typically test for total concentrations, and it gives us overall all forms of lead. We don't know if it's oxides, carbonates, phosphates, or anything else. But when we study bioavailability, it suggests what is the harmful portion of this total availability, total concentration. And it's so we don't always see correlation between bioavailability and total concentrations, because again, you may have very high concentrations, total concentrations in the soil, but maybe it exists in the lead phosphate form and the bioavailability very low, and people will not be exposed to it. Like, so it gets to the human body, it's not, does not dissolve very easily, lead from phosphates, and it just goes through the human body and that's it. But if it's another more diluted or soluble form, then it can be transferred in the body, in the blood for like 28 days, and then goes to bones and goes to brain if there is not enough calcium. If the calcium is present, especially in children, then again, it may not be taken up by bones and goes through the human body. So what we really want to ideally study is bioavailability of metals in the soil. But there is a trick to it because it's hard to study. Bioavailability is typically studied on the animal trials. So it's when they take contaminated soil and feed it to an animal. And then they have to take the test their urine, blood, kidney, and see what the uptake is. It's unethical, time-consuming, very expensive. So scientists came up with different alternative methods, and that was my research, was based in New York, is to study bioaccessibility, which is done in the lab, and it's a proxy for bioavailability. When we create solutions that mimic gastric system at a different pH, and we basically do extractions of lead, mimicking or simulating what could be done in a human stomach. There are also limitations to those methods as well. We do the best what we can, but it's really, if people can invest and send it to a lab. There are only several labs in the country, I think, that offer this to people, but do some bioaccessibility test. It would be good to know not just total concentrations, but also what is the harmful portion of it. And that's what basically bioavailability or bioaccessibility is, the harmful portion. Toxic for people. But plants have different response to contamination as well. It depends what type of plant. Not just because it's lead or arsenic or cadmium is in the soil, doesn't mean it will transport into the food. Because it will depend on the type of the plant. Fruit vegetables like tomatoes, eggplants, squash that grow further from the soil and have the tall, they have physiological barriers inside of the plants, so it prevents from contaminant to go into the fruit. But if it's root vegetables, they have very weak physiological barriers, and there is a high chance of uptake into the root vegetable. And then there are also leafy greens and herbs. They can also get contamination, but from a different mechanism. It's through splashes from surrounding areas. It's not necessarily uptake. It's really because they're short plants and they get dust deposits from like after rain or during rain. So it's just adhesion. It's very hard to wash off soil particles that's on the surface. Washing helps, but doesn't completely wash off contaminants. So this bioavailability for plants or food production will be different depending on the plant type and also how far it grows from contaminated soil.
Thank you. So on that note, Jeanette, can you speak more on contamination and pollution have been an issue with the food produced in your community gardens? And if so, how have these issues been solved?
Yes, so every urban garden in any city, anywhere around the country, or around the globe really needs to be concerned about lead in the soil. While we are bringing in imported soil, meaning we're purchasing clean, tested, lead-free soil, in our case, we get organic soil from a vendor that is able to deliver to both cities where we have our gardens. We know that the soil that is coming in is clean. The question remains, which Dr. Paltseva just said about the contamination from the lot itself. So the ground soil that is there that you're walking on, when there's rain, are you kicking that up? If it's a dry, dusty day, are you kicking that lead up? And is that getting into the soil? So we actually changed our over the years, as we've learned more and more about soil contamination and how to prevent it, we have changed the size of our raised beds. Originally they were 6 inches, now they are 12 inches minimum. We recommend 18 inches as our kind of gold standard for trying to just raise up the height of the beds. And this, there's no way to 100% prevent contamination or to even necessarily test all the gardens. We have 107 gardens. So while we do soil testing, we try to test at least 5 gardens a year, both for the ground soil and the soil inside the beds, as part of our commitment to soil safety. And we are part of the Greater Buffalo Urban Growers. We are the only non-farm partner, so it's mostly urban farmers, and they have locally a pledge to safe soils and to soil testing. And so as part of our commitment to being in that coalition, we do try to test at least 5 gardens a year. We have some gardens, some of our oldest gardens, a handful that are able to grow safely in ground because they have done years and years of extensive soil remediation, and we've been able to test that soil over the years to see that their lot soil is clean. We had one garden that did phytoremediation with sunflowers for 3 years before they planted, and that successfully cleaned the contamination that was in the soil. So it can be done, but as kind of a default, we have to have everyone grow in materials that we provide. So Grassroots Gardens has a preferred lumber provider. We don't want, a lot of people, we understand obviously with the focus on recycling, want to do things like, why can't I just recycle a pallet that I have and make that a raised bed? Well, if you're growing food, that pallet can also have contamination. And so, from chemicals, and we don't want that then getting into your food. So we try to provide all the materials that a community garden needs to get growing safely. And then we also provide that education. So a lot of our gardeners, everyone wants to get their hands in the dirt. And that's beautiful and it's a great feeling. And you need to have gloves on to do that safely, right? And you need to be able to wash your hands as soon as you leave the garden. You need to be able to, if you're coming home, I have a rule in my house because I work in gardens all day long, nobody wears their shoes in the house. They get left outside on the stoop so that we're not tracking, that potential lead from a lot into our home and then getting contaminated with it that way. So I think a lot of it is just public education. We work with a lot of community members that are new to Buffalo and are not aware of the city's industrial past, are not aware that a lot of the vacant land that their current house was built on may have had a house demolished in the past that probably had lead paint that got into the soil. And so we definitely see, Buffalo has high lead tracks in certain zip codes where we know there's even greater contamination. And for our gardens in those neighborhoods, we are especially focused on community education to let people know. We also have a fiscally sponsored project called Buffalo Freedom Gardens that started during COVID as a rapid response to COVID and builds residential gardens in people's homes. And as we have, so through that project, we provide a raised bed to a family, we provide the safe soil, we provide the seeds and the seedlings. Buffalo Freedom Gardens, Ms. Gail Wells, who runs that, who's been a longtime grassroots gardener, does all of that. We help fund it and get the supplies purchased for her and help distribute them. And one of the things we've noticed in going into people's homes and into their backyards and front yards, and everybody that's a gardener wants to show off the garden they have, if they've done it before. We do see a lot of people, both that are new Americans and that are native Buffalonians, that are growing in their backyards or front yards because they need food. And so that's always also an opportunity to make sure people know why the raised bed is important, where they can access additional funding for raised beds or how they can build them more affordably so that they have a chance to learn about, are you aware that there might be lead in that soil? Have you had your children tested for lead? Is this something your family's concerned about? And sometimes we will hear about people's, stories that, oh, this person did have high lead testing when they were 2. And so we just want to encourage people, as we're meeting them and talking about gardening and soil safety, to find healthier ways to do it. And there's often, a financial cost to that. And that's one of the things that Buffalo Freedom Gardens and Grassroots Gardens tries to do, is we don't want there to be a financial burden for people to be healthy and to be able to grow food free of charge. We believe food is a human right, and there shouldn't be a cost to it, and everyone should be able to grow food as they need to. And in order to do that, you have to have lumber that can run, if you're buying cedar lumber, it can run $250 right now for a 4x8 bed. Then you're adding organic soil. The cost of organic seeds, it can get very expensive very quickly to grow the healthiest food possible, even when you're putting in your own labor. So we really try to work with the community, not just to provide the education, but to provide those materials so that people can grow in the ways they want to at home and grow foods that are important to them.
That's so interesting. I grew up in the suburbs, and this isn't anything that I've ever thought about, like the importance of raised soil beds. Not something I've ever thought about. So are all the gardens for grassroots gardens, at least they're required to be raised soil beds, or do you just test the soil in areas where it's not? They are. All right.
So all new gardens have to use either mounded, meaning like they have to have, an 18-inch mound of soil, which, like if they're growing a fruit tree, for example, we know that fruit trees tend to not take up lead into the fruit very often. But in that case, it still has to be a mound of soil just for kind of like added safety. Or we're giving them lumber for the raised beds. We have started in some of the gardens switching to like different kinds of metal containers, stainless steel, things like that we've been testing. But almost all of our gardens, you'll see 4x8, 4x4 raised bed lumber beds. And then there are just a handful of gardens that have been around. Our garden network this year, our oldest gardens are 30 years old, and the organization is 27. The gardens actually predate the start of the organization. So for some of our oldest gardens where they have been composting for 30 years, that soil has been tested and has been found to be clean. But even there, most of the gardeners are still choosing raised beds because it makes gardening easier, right? Permaculture is a great way to garden, but it also means you're getting down into the ground. And we have a lot of seniors that garden with us, that's just really not an option for them anymore. So we've been more and more trying to receive funding to do elevated raised beds that are actually, 4 feet off the ground. One, it's better for the soil contamination because there's less chance of the dust coming up 4 feet. And then 2, for accessibility purposes, they're easier to work with.
All right, great. Thank you. So interesting. Never ever thought about that. All right. And so Dr. Nalam, so for this study that you're all collaborating on, mycelium is used to remediate lead in buffalo soils. Can you tell us a little bit about what mycelium is and what your findings are?
Yes. So mycelium is the root part of mushrooms. So whatever mushrooms that we see when we're walking in the woods are actually the fruiting bodies. So that's just probably 1/1,000,000th of the entire plant that is inside, or fungus that is inside the soil. And the fungal networks are known to spread as the neurons spread in our brain. So they're all interconnected and crisscrossed, and they have a lot of symbiosis effect with all the plants, microorganisms that are there in the surroundings. So they are known for best for absorbing anything that's surrounding them. If it's a dead creatures or toxin materials or nutrients, they tend to assimilate them and then remediate them from the environment. And in this process, they can also sense sort of chemical gradients within the soil. And if there is some place where they need like more nutrients, or if there is a need for like nourishment, they can actually transport nutrients to make things more homogeneous in the entire network. So we already know that live mycelium or the live fungi are very good toxin removers. But as I said, not everyone can grow mushrooms in their backyard, especially in Buffalo. Half of the time it's cold, and we need usually a damp, dark conditions to grow mushrooms. So this, even though it's such a sustainable option and a cheap option and an environmentally friendly option, it's just that not everyone is expert in growing mushrooms first, and then mushrooms are very choosy where they want to grow and how much they want to grow. So this actually led us to thinking that can we now actually make materials out of them, like a biomaterial out of them, so that we could easily transport and move them wherever we want. Let's say, like Janet said, we have these raised beds, or we have our own backyard soil. So can we insert these sheets of mycelium in these beds, or and like little bit plow over topsoil and then insert into the topsoil, and then leave it for some time so that the mycelium does the whole attracting the lead from the soil, and then later on we carefully remove it out, and then we dispose it off in such way we could use our own backyard soil for like growing vegetables and stuff. So this brought us many fundamental questions. So though there has been research on how live mycelium assimilates all these heavy metals, it's basically works with lots of proteins that are there on its cell wall. It works with lots of enzymes that it kind of generates. And they basically, and endocytosis means like they kind of eat it, literally eat it into themselves, and the cell inside the cell, they get disintegrated. So, but it's no longer live when we are drying it. When I say dry, means we literally bake them to a very high temperature, around 80 degrees and above. And so all the live cells are dead. But what stays behind is the rich network of proteins on the top of these fibers. And those contribute to a lot of absorption of these lead ions from the environment, whether it's from water, whether it's from soil. They can absorb the lead, and it's kind of you sticking them kind of a thing. So the question was, are these proteins still are active to do such a process once they are dried? And if so, what is the efficiency for them to do it? And can we do something, or can we now modify or treat these membranes such that we can actually convert this lead into forms like what Anya just said, into like phosphates or stuff like that, so that we reduce the bioavailability to the animals and stuff like that. So these were fundamental research questions that we wanted to ask even before we deploy them in the soil. And in that process, we have been trying to play around understanding what kind of proteins are still there and what was the capacity of absorption. And we also now started treating our membranes with the phosphate solutions and then expose it to lead. And we got more than 90 to 95% of remediation of lead from a solution, but that means in a water-based system. And what we also did is also big factors that play a role is the concentration of the lead. Like Anya said, there can be different concentrations of lead depending upon where the lot is, and then where what was the prehistory of the lot is, and each soil have their own pH of the soil, and they all impact how efficiently these proteins will now interact with the lead. So we wanted to understand all these parameters systematically in laboratory conditions to know that what and all mechanisms really involve and which of the mechanisms have the most remediation efficiencies. So once we identify them, then we can use those treated membranes and then can start deploying them into the soil and see that how effective we are in the soil. So this is where we are currently also in the project, that we finished our initial studies in the laboratory studies, and we have identified 2 mechanisms. And as I said, one mechanism is bioadsorption. So individual lead ion, if it is available, they could come and directly attach to these proteins. But we also add these specific metals, specific compounds like phosphate, which we usually add anyways in our nutrients. So phosphate is not something we're adding out of ordinary or something. So these phosphates end up making crystallized of lead. So we get lead phosphates and lead carbonate crystals. And now we are trapping those crystals onto this membrane. And in this way, in both these processes, we saw that if we combine them, we get the highest efficiency of remediation.
That's really amazing. Can you, Dr. Nalam, I know that you use microscopy imaging. Can you explain what that is and how it's used in this study?
Yes, so we use scanning electron microscopy, which is, if you know the regular optical microscope, you shine in few light to that, and then you see any features that you want to see. But these fibers, the mycelium fibers, are as thin as your hair or even thinner than that. So if you want to see what kind of interactions are happening and how is lead getting deposited on them, you no longer can use optical microscope. So we actually use this more high resolution microscope called the scanning electron microscope, where instead of light, we now bombard the sample with electrons, beam of electrons. And that helps us to give a very high resolution image of the mycelium. And we try to see them images with just pure, as I said, like bioadsorption, where we don't add any other additional phosphate. Or when we add phosphate, we see this crystal growth happening. So we can understand at what concentrations, how much crystal growth it is occurring, what are the rates of these crystal growth, and also what is the percentage of the mycelium is getting covered with lead. So we can map all those things, which can all help us to determine the efficiency and the performance of a specific mechanism that we are trying to look at.
And I know, Dr. Nalam, you spoke on this a little bit already, but is there a possibility for mycelium to be used to remediate other heavy metals usually found in urban soils?
Yes, definitely. There are many inorganic compounds like arsenic, mercury, cobalt. They have come from different sources, different industrial sources. They've all got accumulated in the soil, and they again every of these these heavy metals will have their own compounds because they don't stay as like just metal ions by themselves. So they make these compounds, and the mechanisms will be more or less the same as we are studying for the lead, so they could be easily extrapolated to the other heavy metals. And we believe that this trimycelium would still have a very high efficiency to remediate other heavy metals from the soil. What is more interesting is also that not just heavy metals, but mycelium is also has a nature to absorb organic matter, and that's not a property of every filtrant that's there in the market. Usually, most of the filtrants that are there are polymeric synthetic materials, but mycelium is in such a way that it can, its proteins are in such a way that it can absorb not only just heavy metals, but also organics. And PFASs are one of the more concerning issues currently that the EPA is looking at, and the mycelium is also it could be one of the membrane that can remove this, and that should be an interesting study to carry out.
All right, great. Thank you. We're going to skip ahead a little bit and lean into the policy side a little bit, because we've talked so much about all the great science that you're doing. So how does this translate into policy? How do you have to collaborate with government or other organizations in order to get your research heard and seen and for action to be taken? Dr. Paltseva, do you want to talk a little bit about this? Have you had success with this?
Well, I worked a little bit less with the policymakers than other researchers, and I think in this project it was mostly other like Kassia and Olga and Prathima, who did a lot of work in the collaboration, like actually creating collaborations and work with the city of Buffalo. So I kind of stayed away from it because that kind of not exactly my area of expertise, but I definitely enjoy being on meetings where we have different organizations, not just the scientists, but the city, the nonprofit organizations, and garden representatives, because you can actually learn what it takes to get your results to the policy and what they are looking for, what they're looking at when they evaluate science results. So it definitely benefits me as a researcher to see how it works, but I kind of was shielded from figuring out the logistics behind it by some senior colleagues.
I think there's definitely been success. Grassroots Gardens, before I was involved in it, back in like 2012, 2013, were invited by the city of Buffalo to participate in the green code that was made, and is really one of the most successful green codes in the country. And the city of Buffalo does have a role in this grant, is a key partner in it. And so they have been very supportive and I think very interested in, the potential for this technology, and really at the forefront of wanting to figure out, this I mean, the industrial pollution in Buffalo and the legacy contamination has been an albatross around the neck of everyone that lives in the city government. It's, would be millions and millions and millions of dollars to remediate every lot here. And so they have a vested interest, both financially, but I think ethically too, in determining, what are better ways to do this. And again, I kept coming back to what was so exciting to me about this project was you're using a natural substance straight from Mother Earth to clean the damage that humans have done to the earth. And so, to kind of be able to come full circle like that and find the answer right in nature as to, one way we might be able to better clean up the kind of mess that we've collectively made as humans to the land. So I do think they are listening, and I think there is great potential in this in terms of policy. And we have another partner on the grant, Dr. Emmanuel Frimpong, and he is the evaluator on it. And he's looking at not just kind of the implications for policy in terms of the land contamination, but policy for how we support and educate and implement education in the community around soil safety.
All right. And then I know you touched on this a little bit, Jeanette, but what can farmers do especially urban farmers do to keep themselves safe as this potential new program is being rolled out?
Yeah, so one of the things that we were really interested in and were able to get the funding from HUD on this grant to do was to revise a project we have called Safe Roots. And that is our public education campaign on soil safety. Way back in 2013-14, we had some funding to offer the creation of Safe Roots guidebooks and Safe Roots workshops that worked primarily at that time in the New American communities. We were able to get the guide translated and to provide our growers in urban areas, whether they're farmers or gardeners, with information on how to keep yourself and your family safe while you're growing in a city. So the funding in this project is also supporting kind of our revision of that, because it's been 10 years almost, and it's time to, update it all. And so we also have been working with our partners at the Western York Children's Environmental Health Center to update the guidebooks. They're going to be published in 9 languages. We have a burgeoning New American population in the city of Buffalo, which is why our census data has gone up for the first time in 40 or 50 years. And we have people that are interested that have come from agricultural backgrounds that want to be urban farmers here. And so, through groups like the Greater Buffalo Urban Growers, connecting them to coalition groups of farmers and growers that are well versed in, how to grow safely in the city. I think, again, just at a very individual level, it's about protective equipment. It's about hand washing and vegetable washing, and making sure that, along every step of the way, from the first time you walk on the soil until you leave the soil, and getting, leaving your clothes out and getting them washed appropriately. And there are so many steps you can take, and we really try to lay out in the guidebook what that looks like. So if you are, visiting any of the urban farms in Buffalo, you'll often see that most of them, again, unless they have been well established and well composted and well been able to remediate the soil, are growing raised beds. They will often bring in outside soil. And then they also, we provide education on things like how to gather rain safely. A lot of people assume, if I gather the rain, I can use it in my garden. Well, it depends on how you're collecting it. If it's coming off your asphalt shingled roof, it is not safe because of the contamination from the shingles. And so, we encourage rainwater harvesting, but not using it for food production and food watering. And so, those are all things that have to be considered along the kind of growth cycle of the garden itself or the farm. And obviously farming's at a much larger level than we're doing at Grassroots Gardens. We are kind of we consider ourselves at a neighborhood scale and not at an urban farm scale of growing. But a lot of the same principles apply for soil safety. And so those guidebooks should be being released before the spring. We are working with partners at International Institute right now, and a wonderful graphic designer, Rachel Bridges, who I'd like to give a shout out to, who's helped us really bring the look of the guidebooks into the 2020s. And so those will be going into final production in the next couple of weeks, and we'll be able to share them out for free with the public, hopefully by spring 2023.
That's so exciting. And we'll definitely share the guidebook with the episode release so that more people are able to see it. That's so cool.
Yeah, I was just going to say that's awesome.
And I would also pose this question to all of you. What is the single greatest thing and the most important thing that we can do to protect human health when it comes to urban agriculture and contamination?
I think what first comes to my mind is to spread more information, and you are doing part of it, through modern technologies and social media outlets. So thank you for you doing this podcast and spreading the word on science. And I think that's just do more for public outreach and education and work with partners outside of academia, bring science to people in the most digestible way. And what Jeanette described is just perfect. That's what we need more in every city.
Yeah, I think I would just encourage people, we've been talking about contamination and the fear around it, right? Like, am I going to grow food and hurt my family? And there's research study after research study after study that shows the benefits of growing food at home far outweigh the risk of the contamination. You do need to be aware of it. You need to do things to minimize it, but in no way want anyone to leave here thinking like it's not safe to grow food in a city. It very much is, and we hope to be a resource. Not just for community gardeners. We have a ton of resources on the grassrootsgardens.org website, and you can go there as a home gardener and learn a lot about how to grow your garden at home safely in the city. So really just want to encourage people to lean into gardening, see it as the gift that it is, and know that there are organizations like Grassroots that can support you, whether you have a financial burden to getting safe materials for growing or whether you need that education. And even better, if you want to join a community garden so you don't have to grow alone and you can get to meet your neighbors and come and enjoy the kind of garden party that we have when we're growing together. It's a lot of fun. And, the community of gardeners in Buffalo is just an amazing, fantastic resource too. So I would put a plug in to keep growing and don't let it stop you from being able to grow.
So I would just conclude by saying that the soil, the current rate at which it is deteriorating, there is a literal unavailability of soil for growing food, and we already have food scarcity. And 20 to 40 years from now, we will no longer have agricultural soil to meet, like probably 9 billion will hit soon, probably of population to come soon. So urban gardening, it will be one of the key ways to go about it. And one thing is, that has also been the key factor of our project, is public awareness that this needs to be known, that there are contaminants and the way they get contaminated and how can you remediate them is very, very critical. And also that all citizens need to start deciding or insisting on policy making for these so that this gets included in our agendas at the highest level to the most household level, so that we can act now. Only if we can act now, then we can, the next 20, 30 years are very, very critical for us to bring back Mother Earth's soil to us back. So I feel that's the need of the hour, as important as climate change, if I want to put it there.
Or no better team to tackle it than you three, I would say. All right. Is there anything else that you want to add or plug or shout out before we end?
If anyone wants to test soil, they can send it to Louisiana at the Delta Urban Soils Lab, and we accept samples from all over the country.
We really can't thank you enough for being here. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today. This has been another episode of Buffalo HealthCast. Thank you to our guests, Dr. Prathima Nalam, Dr. Anya Paltseva, and Jeanette Koncikowski. Omar Brown is our sound editor, and our theme music was written and recorded by Sungmin Shin of the UB Music Department. This episode was written and recorded by Sarah Robinson, Leah Bargnesi, and Sid Benuna for Dr. Akasha Cordis' Global Health class in fall 2022. I'm Sarah Robinson, your production assistant. Join us next time on Buffalo HealthCast to learn more about health equity in Buffalo, New York, the US, and around the globe.